Just say welcome to Tommy Sveen, who's going to talk to us about monetary and fiscal policy.
Yes, go ahead. So, thanks for having me. The first time I ever present something in Iceland, which is nice. I'm here for kind of combination of a vacation and a holiday, and my partner, she is presenting something for the health Ministry of Health here in Iceland today and tomorrow, and I thought about using the opportunity to also present something while being in Reykjavik. So what this is, it's joint paper with some former colleagues at Norges Bank, so the Central Bank of Norway. And what we are thinking about is how to combine in an optimal way fiscal and monetary policy. That's kind of the objective of the paper. So let's see if I can make it. So the kind of the general question that we ask in the paper is how should you define fiscal policy so that it supports in the best possible way what we think monetary policy should achieve. Basically, what we think about monetary policy should achieve is keeping inflation stable at the minimum cost. So inflation should be close to the target. We should try to do that without disturbing too much the real economy, because that is the typical trait of a monetary policy. Or to rephrase, if you think about the two policy instruments as being just policy instrument, how should you combine the two instruments in an optimal way? A sort of mix of fiscal and monetary policy. So I will focus on some of one particular shock in particular, and that's the inflation shock. So that's a kind of sudden increase in domestic prices that is not linked to economic activity. Think about it as an increase in energy prices, for instance, drives up inflation. What should then monetary policy do, and what should fiscal policy do to help monetary policy in achieving the target? So, if you go back even before I was born, so it's a long time ago, in the early 1960s, Mendel wrote about policy in a way that is relevant for this paper, namely, how would you, if you have more than one policy instrument, which policy instrument should you use? And what he recommends is that each instrument should be used where it is most efficient. That was his suggestion. So if you have a policy instrument that has a comparative advantage in stabilizing something, well, that's where you should use that policy instrument. Kind of winding up kind of 30, 40 years later, many countries around the world were doing inflation targeting. And at least in the starting point of inflation targeting, the idea was that you should keep a fiscal policy away. You should let monetary policy do business cycle or worry about business cycle fluctuations. Fiscal policy was seen to be too slow and too much political influence to be useful for counter-cyclical policy. Now, in the financial crisis, that changed somehow, and in particular, the main reason for that was that we hit the lower zero bound. So all of a sudden, you had you wanted to have a stimulus, but there was simply no way anymore to use monetary policy because you have already reached zero interest rate. And the same thing happened over again during the pandemic. Many countries reduced interest rate quite heavily, and what we saw was that it is helpful to also use fiscal policy in such cases. So now the focus on the policymakers is somewhat different. It's no longer just kind of just thinking about monetary policy as the first line of defense. It's more the combination of the two policy instruments or the two policy areas, how to best combine them. Combine monetary fiscal policy to achieve some goals. What's the standard view? The standard view is the following. Fiscal policy should help central bank bringing down inflation if inflation is too high. So when inflation is too high, we typically use contractionary monetary policy, but in those circumstances, fiscal policy should also be contractionary, and in that way it will help to bring inflation down. That's the standard view of many policymakers and also many economists. And what I have here is a couple of examples from the IMF. Those are examples written about Norwegian policy. Fiscal policy can and should support monetary policy in bringing inflation back to target in a timely manner, or a tighter fiscal policy while providing targeted support to the most vulnerable should complement efforts by the monetary authorities to bring inflation back to target, making it possible for the central bank to increase interest rates by less than otherwise. So the standard view is that if there is something that drives up inflation, what you should do is use a combination of fiscal and monetary policy to bring inflation down. What we do in this paper is to challenge this view. And what we argue is that it's completely wrong. You have a wrong sign for fiscal policy. Fiscal policy should not be contractionary, it should be expansionary in such cases. I hopefully will be able to explain to you why. So what we're going to see is that very often monetary and fiscal policy, there should be what we call divergent. They should pull in opposite direction. So very often, if you have cases where you want to have contractionary monetary policy, typically you want to have expansionary fiscal policy. What's the main argument? Well, it's related to Mundell and his whole view that you should use the instrument for the objective or the target where it is most effective. Where is the interest rate most effective? It's on stabilizing inflation. Where is fiscal policy more effective? Stabilizing output. So that's the division of that. So use monetary policy to bring inflation down, and then use fiscal policy to stabilize output. But since monetary policy is contractionary, if inflation is too high, what you should use is expansion of fiscal policy to reduce the impact on the economic activity. And we have two instruments. We have fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy works basically through demand. So when the way you can influence inflation by fiscal policy is that increase or decrease spending, And an increase in spending typically raises inflation, a reduction in spending typically reduces inflation. So it's through aggregate demand. The fiscal policy works through aggregate demand. Monetary policy also works through aggregate demand. When you lower the real interest rate, or it's near a reduction in the real interest rate, obviously that will create more demand. But monetary policy also works through the exchange rate. There are two channels for monetary policy. You have the fiscal, you have the demand channel, and you have a direct exchange rate channel. And it is the presence of the latter that makes monetary policy more effective on stabilizing inflation. So we have monetary policy as a comparative advantage to stabilizing inflation in this case, while fiscal policy has the comparative advantage in stabilizing output. And then according to Mendel, that's where the instrument should be used. What that will mean, what that will imply, is that we're going to have situations where you have contraction of monetary policy because of an increase in inflation, combined with expansion of fiscal policy, which kind of tries to make up for the fact that the central bank is driving the economy into a recession. Okay. I'm gonna try to make this there's a big clock here. This thing in the most simple framework that I can think of, and that's these two equations, and with one simple assumption. We're going to assume that my measure of economic activity, and I'm going to call that this Y as the output gap. That's this variable is positive when we are in a boom, and it's negative when we are in a recession. We measure it as a deviation from some natural level of output. And what we assume is kind of standard relationship between the real interest rate and public spending and this economic activity. An increase in public spending will tend to increase economic activity. An increase in the real interest rate will tend to reduce economic activity. So it's completely standard. But it's not that we assume something strange on how the interest rate works. Similarly, for inflation, we have that an increase in public spending tends to increase inflation because demand increases, and an increase in real interest rate or expansion or the contractionary monetary policy tends to reduce inflation. This is a standard way of how these variables affect the two variables that the central bank and the government cares about, economic activity and the rate of inflation. Now, notice that we have that's where this shock comes in, so that's what I call the inflation shock. Something that kind of drives inflation up and down and has nothing to do with economic activity, some other things driving inflation up and down. The typical example is energy prices. Then we assume that monetary policy has a comparative advantage in stabilizing inflation relative to fiscal policy. And that's the most easy way to think about that is that in an open economy, monetary policy affects inflation also via the exchange rate. Now I lost it again. I don't know where here. Let's take it here. I think it's outside. Oh, there it is. Yep. I think we can skip that. Now, so given this this very simple model, those two equations, and the fact that there are two instruments. Well, with two instruments, we can reach two goals. And I here just assume that what we want to do is to have inflation equal to zero. I just use zero, or I measure everything in relative to the inflation target. And I would like to have real economic activity being zero as well, or the output gap being zero, so output always being equal to the natural level of output. So no business cycles and no variation in inflation. That is it, that I can achieve because I have two instruments. Now if I take these two equations, 1 and 2, I set both the output gap and the rate of inflation equal to zero. I solve it for the real interest rate. And now I see that there's a mistake. I thought that one should be this one. Yeah, this one should be G. One of the two should be G, the other one should be R. What is important is that they have the same sign. So a positive cost per shock, or an increase in inflation, leads to an increase in the real interest rate, and at the same time an increase in public spending. So both a higher interest rate and expansionary fiscal policy. So contractionary monetary policy combined with expansionary fiscal policy is the optimal mix in order to achieve the two goals: inflation equal to the target and no business cycle fluctuations. What is going on? So what is the economic mechanism that we now see? So monetary policy will you increase the interest rate in order to bring inflation down. That happens through two channels. It will lead to an appreciation of the currency and lowering of demand because of the higher real interest rate. You're going to have a reduction in economic activity and then also a reduction in inflation. In a standard situation where we only discuss monetary policy, that is the typical kind of the way we describe inflation target. That's what the inflation target is all about. If inflation is too high, the central bank should drive the economy into a recession to bring inflation down again. That's what we tell our students. That is inflation targeting. Here, you have two instruments, so you can do better than that. And in what way would we like to do better? Well, we would like to reduce this cost of bringing inflation down. Namely, we would like to avoid the recession. And we can do that by expansionary fiscal policy.
Just to be clear, so if the oil price goes from 60 to 120,
yeah,
just to put it in perspective, then you suggest, okay, as a result of that, you should raise interest rates and hire more civil servants,
yeah,
and run a budget deficit, presumably, or raise taxes, or.
How you finance that, I don't know, but but you can borrow, for instance, yes.
Yeah, or lower taxes, but no, that doesn't increase G.
But what is important is that you increase spending.
Increase spending, yeah.
Increase
okay, so hire more civil servants,
yeah,
and raise interest rates.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you only raise interest rates, you're going to drive the economy into recession. And that's completely unnecessary. And it's a cost of bringing inflation down, and we won't like to avoid it.
But you would agree that when you hire these additional public service people, you will increase demand,
Yep.
and that will contribute to
higher
inflation.
Yes.
But you say that would still, as it would move.
Yeah, because what you're going to do
to the optimal, that additional inflation is excusable.
No. So in equilibrium, what you're going to have is quite a bit more contractionary monetary policy. Because you need to, of course, the
interest rate will be higher.
Exactly. So this increasing spending on the public sector will in itself increase interest rate even more, which will increase public spending slightly a bit more. In equilibrium, you're going to have quite a bit of contractionary monetary policy combined with expansionary fiscal policy, and those two cancel out on the economic activity, but they do not cancel out on inflation. It will drive inflation down because you have strengthened the currency quite a bit. It is strengthening the currency yeah.
And then when the oil price comes down from 120 to 60 again,
then you do the opposite.
Interest rates and fire on the civil servants.
Yeah.
Again.
So probably it's not a wise thing to do this in civil servants. What you should do is to buy goods or buy from private firms, for instance. You can, for instance, whenever you're in a recession, what you should do is to hire, or not hire, but you should put on and let the private sector come in and update all public investment or public infrastructure, for instance. So typically, in that kind of sectors, that's exactly where you're going to typically see the.
You can build a bridge.
Exactly, you can build a bridge, but don't do it in hiring civil servants, because probably those are very hard to get rid of afterwards. But if a private firm, you hire it to do a specific job, that you can do. Okay. Let's see. So this, I'm not sure how helpful this figure is. No, I'm going to skip it. We're going to work ourselves through the model instead. So of course, the thing that you mentioned are important. Our simple model, so far, there's no intertemporal adjustment. So I can use fiscal spending, and there's no memory of my model. Next period, I start from scratch again. What we have here is an intertemporal model. And then I need to take into account, for instance, that if I have fiscal deficit now, and at some point in the future, I better have fiscal surplus in order to pay back what the government borrowed. So what we're going to have here is a model, the Galli-Monticelli model, which is a new Keynesian model. We extend it with what is called the bells and whistles. So the original Galli-Monticelli model is very elegant, very neat. Doesn't describe data very well, but it's very cute. We're going to keep some of the cute aspects of the model, but extend it so that it is better to describe data. And in particular, we add things like habit persistence in consumption. We have in price setting, firms are not only forward-looking, they're also backward-looking. These things that make those kind of models perform better empirically. So what we have here, private consumption is then given by an Euler equation. H is the habit persistence. So it's easier to think about it without H, with H equal to 0. Then you have a kind of standard consumption Euler equation. Consumption consumption is a function of the real interest rate, and compared to what I expect tomorrow's consumption to be. So consumption is then a jump variable. I jump whenever I see, in order to react to the interest rate. And all other things equal, I would like consumption to be smooth over time. So that's my objective. I deviate from that when when the interest rate is temporarily high or low. And I allow myself to deviate from this constant consumption over time. Here, it's the same equation, if we just added this habit persistence in there. This is aggregate consumption. Aggregate consumption consists of consuming two types of goods, the goods that we produce ourselves and the goods that we import from abroad. We're going to focus on the small open economy, and we're going to distinguish between two countries in this world. It's the small open economy and the rest of the world. The rest of the world is enclosed, the closed economy. The world itself is closed. And the small open economy is so small that it does not affect anything in the rest of the world. It's a truly small open economy. It has zero influence over everything else in the economy. And consumption is then a kind of weighted average of consume. I mean, I consume some goods that we produce ourselves and some goods that we import from abroad. That, of course, will influence consumption, but it also influences the way we construct CPI, the Consumer Price Index. We're going to have market clearing for all goods. We're going to assume that public spending only uses domestically produced goods. It could have used that they hire civil servants, or that it's labor, just that they hire. Here, what we assume that there is some goods that we buy from a private sector, but they are all produced domestically. We know that the input share in public spending is lower than the input share in total, but it's not zero, but that's what we assume here. Wouldn't change much though. Then we have the typical inflation equations that we know from the New Keynesian framework, the New Keynesian Phillips curve. Here there is this gamma here, which is indexation to past inflation rates. To understand the equation, it's easier to again to assume that this is zero, there is no indexation. Then we have the standard New Keynesian Phillips curve. Inflation today is a function of inflation tomorrow, and a markup. So a markup meaning price over marginal cost. That's this term here. If prices are higher than the marginal cost, it will tend to reduce inflation over time. And vice versa, if marginal costs are higher than the prices, that will tend to increase prices over time. That's what this equation says. And then we have added this cost term here, and that's this what we call typically is called the cost push shock or inflation shock. So that is an increase in inflation that has nothing to do with real economic activity. So we have a Phillips curve for domestic produced goods and also a Phillips curve for imported goods. So we have the importers that buy these goods abroad and bring them into the domestic economy and price them locally, and they have also price stickiness in that pricing behavior. Then we're going to have trade balance, and of course this is one kind of important equation now, because we need to track how the net foreign assets position is over time. Net foreign assets today is whatever we had on net foreign assets last period, taking into account the interest rate and the trade balance this period. So it's kind of, so if we have a trade balance surplus, well, then we build up foreign assets, so foreign wealth. Okay.
Yes.
We're going to assume that we have some kind of uncovered interest rate parity, some kind of, in the sense that we're going to assume that there is a risk premium, and that risk premium is a function of the net foreign assets. So a country that has a lot of net foreign assets, they pay lower risk premium lower than countries with high debt. There's a minus here. So countries with high debt, foreign debt, will pay higher interest rates. This is a trick in order to make this model be stationary, because it will mean that if only when net foreign asset is zero, the interest rates will equalize across countries. So this will give a tendency for whenever there is if you have high net foreign assets, you get low return. So there's an extra spending motive, and vice versa. When if you have a lot of debt, if you pay a high interest rate, it discourages spending. So you want to save instead, and that saving will reduce the net foreign assets. So it's a trick in the literature in order to make these models being stationary. Because otherwise all these types of models are non-stationary, all shocks have permanent effects. It is no shock have permanent effects.
So R stands for what and P stands for what?
So RP, that's a risk premium.
Oh, risk premium.
Yeah,
okay,
risk premium.
Yeah.
So that, and this is the nominal interest rate.
Okay.
And this is then the change in the nominal exchange rate. So it's a kind of so without this, it's a standard uncovered interest rate parity. You equalize nominal return across countries. For foreign investments, you have two types of return. You have the interest rate, but also exchange rate return. In addition, we add on this. And this is where there is a fiscal budget constraint. So we don't cheat. We don't let fiscal policy spend and then forget that they spent. And we introduce here a tax, and this tax is set in such a way that that you get debt being stable over time. So this tax level endogenously adjusts in order to make sure that the government budget constraint holds, so that we don't have kind of exploding debt or something on the public sector. Then the last equation I want to show you is this thing here, and that's the loss function. And the loss function, if either you're used to the loss function or you're not. I worked a lot in monetary policy in my years, and we do this all the time. This is how we think about what brings unhappiness to the governor. The governor would like to have inflation close to the target. Here I've assumed that the target is zero. So the inflation target is zero. And the government would like the economic activity to be stable as well. Both things is important for the government. And then what we do is to, since this is a dynamic model, we're going to assume that the governor or the central bank or the fiscal authorities or the authority minimizes this loss function, but not only this period, but the infinitely discounted sum of future losses. This is how the loss function looks like. Now what I've done is I've chosen lambda to be to 1. Then you get these very nice round circles. We would like to be here now. Here's I've introduced P star in this paper. I've chosen that to be 0. In general, you can have a different. Typically, central banks have inflation target that is not 0. It's slightly above 0. We would like to be here. Inflation at the target and gap being 0. That you're a normal level of economic activity. The further out, the larger the circle, the larger is the loss, the further away you are from what is optimal. And I don't think I'm going to spend too much on this, but when I tell my students about why is this exactly the same thing as the preferences that we are used to from micro, I always use coffee and cake as an example. And we have, these are how we expect indifference curves to look like for those two goods, coffee and cake. The only thing I needed to add now to make my story about monetary policy kind of work is I need to give an explanation for this point. In micro we call that the situation point. That's the point where you would be if coffee and cake is free. You will not, typically not consume infinite amount of coffee and cake. You will consume cake and coffee up to the point where the marginal utility of consume a little bit more is 0. And you stop. So for all those goods that have a saturation point, indifference curves will look like that. It will end here. That's the point where you're going to go if those two goods are for free. And of course, that's exactly, then there is an expansion path, and that's exactly what these things tell us. The only trick here is to remember that only down here do we want to have more inflation and more economic activity. If we are up here, we like the opposite. And inflation is too high, and economic activity is too high. So we like to go in that direction. And if we kind of look towards the middle along the expansion path, we do see exactly the same curvature and everything that we are used to from micro, that explains our indifference curves. So these are our preferences, just as we are used to see them. The only thing different is that we need to remember where we want to go. If we don't want to go up here, we want to go into the middle. Okay. We're going to do the same thing now in our model. This is a medium scale new tension model. We're going to shock that model, and we're going to see how policy will react, both fiscal and monetary policy will react to this shock. And we're going to do it in two steps. First, we're going to assume that fiscal policy is passive, and then we're going to introduce active fiscal policy afterwards. And that's what we have here. I'm not going to talk about all the variables, but I'm going to talk about some of the variables. First, the blue lines here, that's kind of the typical monetary policy analysis that we are used to without kind of ignore fiscal policy. We have output or the output gap, we have inflation, we imported inflation on the exchange rate, the real exchange rate, the real interest rate, public spending, and the policy rate. So this is a shock to inflation. So there's something driving up inflation domestically. Let's see here. If we only have monetary policy, then what we typically kind of teach our students is that, well, inflation targeting is about driving the economy into a recession, So they do that by increasing the real interest rates. And in that way, we bring inflation down again. That's inflation targeting. So you increase the policy rates with the objective to bring inflation down again after this, because inflation has been hit by this exogenous increase in the rate of inflation. Why do you want to do that? Because these preferences that we just talked about, these preferences penalize heavily when one variable is large and the other one is small. What you want to do is to have a balanced development of the two variables. So it's better to allow the economy to fall into a recession. Of course, we don't like that. Central bank would like to avoid this if it could, but that's better because that will reduce the impact on inflation. There's a better trade-off when we have inflation hit by an exogenous shock. Now, so that's by assumption. We just set public spending to be constant. What happens then if we have a law for optimal coordination of optimal both fiscal and monetary policy? Well, then again we can achieve the first best. Again, then we have two instruments and two targets. So we can have the output gap being zero and inflation staying at the constant zero level all the time. How do we do that? Well, we do that by increasing the policy rate, combine it with an increase in public spending. And this increase in public spending, together with the policy rate, is what is needed in order to keep economic activity at the optimal level all the time. But this you see that's here. So the inflation rate is then also stabilized, and the way it is stabilized is by reducing imported inflation. It's not so domestic inflation does not change at all. Why? Because economic activity doesn't change. So firms have no incentive to change their pricing for the domestic produced goods. The labor market is exactly as in steady state. So there is no cost or anything influencing those firms. So domestic inflation stays constant. Apart from, of course, there is this shock that has driven up inflation. But combined with imported inflation being negative, you get average inflation being zero. And the central bank cares about average inflation, the CPI inflation. So what we do is we use fiscal policy to clean up the mess of what is created by monetary policy. And what's the mess that it creates? Well, the mess it creates is it brings the economy into a recession, and we don't like the recession and we can avoid it. But of course, notice that this is completely opposite of what, at least in Norway, that the politicians talk about all the time, that a reason for not spending is always inflation. Here, we should spend when there is inflation. Yes?
I come to think about the Reagan policy in the early 80s when we had rising energy prices and very high interest rates to fight inflation and increased spending, military spending.
Yeah, Norway as well. Yeah, and then constant devaluations. I probably hear as well.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, in that point, so this of course takes as grant as given that there is no uncertainty regarding the nominal anchor here.
Yeah.
So the credibility of the central bank is undoubted here. What we had, at least in Norway in the 80s, is kind of, I think we had 10 devaluations over 10 years. So every year we had a devaluation. And they said, oh no, this is the last one. And of course everyone thought that no, this is not the last one, it's going to be exactly as last year. And we did it again. Because it was simply too costly, because the wages increased a lot, and then there was this expectation that in order to fix this, we had to devalue, and that's in the end what we did. And we lost completely control of the inflation target. Here we have assumed that inflation target is credible. Moreover, there is no reason not there is no reason to doubt here, because we don't even get inflation here.
In your model,
Yeah.
the mechanism is through the demand, and
Yeah.
of course the exchange rate.
Yeah.
But the shock, they are not, they are exogenous.
Yeah.
They are all price shocks. In traditional monetary theory, the apparatus,
Yeah.
the Taylor rule and everything like that is because we are focusing on demand, and the demand causes for inflation.
Yeah.
But when there are supply shocks, those instruments, you shouldn't, at least not in the beginning, you should perhaps think about secondary effects of a oil price shock. But the primary shock should be allowed to go through. That would be the optimal policy according to traditional monetary theory.
Yeah.
Why are you saying a different story from that?
Yeah, so why is this different? The main reason is that here price change is inflation. It's inflationary. Yeah. Even though, because I know that in the old days they thought about, well, what is if it's only a one-time price change, then it's not inflation. Here, it's one-time price changes will here lead to a process of inflation.
Well,
it will start a process of inflation.
If the oil price goes from 60 to 120,
yeah, that will
one-time increase in the rate of inflation, and maybe just 1 month, and then the inflation continues at the same rate if nothing else happens.
I guess that's an empirical question. What will happen? I think that the second, and third, and fourth order effect will.
So that's a historical expectation. If you see, if the price jumps and you have 5% inflation because of that, and not 2.5, and then everybody assumes it's going to stay at 5 perpetually, of course.
Yeah,
then you just have inflation of the mind.
But if you think about 22. People in the beginning were, and as I understand it's the same situation now, people are mainly expecting this price increase from March to go down, and go down to 60, 70, but we don't know when.
But at least, I don't know, but at least in Norway, what we have seen is that inflation, inflation has come down since we had a kind of peak of 7-8%, but it's taken several years. And it's rounds of inflation. But even though the initial one is driven by a kind of exogenous.
When you talk about an increase in prices and inflation, there are people saying we should not be satisfied with the inflation coming down from the 22 inflation. We should bring the price at the pump down to what it was before.
So there is this argument in this literature that there is a gain from committing to bringing the price level down again. That has a commitment gain. So what we look at here is discretion. So we think that the central bank cannot commit itself to future actions. One way of committing itself is to give the central bank a price level target instead of an inflation target. So what's the whole thing? So think about this thing here. If you have a price level target, then of course now here there will be an inflation, so prices are up. So you need to somehow, after a period with inflation, you need to have a period with deflation. That's the only way to bring the price level down again. The advantage of that is that when firms here, at this point in time, then they see that into the future, I'm going to have deflation, that will give them an incentive not to increase prices as much today. Because they know that soon my prices will be, even though I don't increase them as much, soon they will be okay because very soon they're going to be deflation. And it's this additional, this commitment gain or the gain from price over targeting. That's what some argue that's why you should have a price over target instead of an inflation target. Here we don't go into that at all. We just assume that there is an inflation target. Another Bank of Canada, they had a evaluation of whether they should move to price level targeting instead of inflation targeting, but they didn't dare to in the end. There was a lot of arguments in favor of moving to price level targeting, but in the end they kept their inflation target. What can be said about this is that this gain from commitment builds very heavily on the fact that the new Keynesian curve is a forward-looking variable. In the data, it's not that obvious that it is that forward-looking. A lot more backward-lookingness, and it doesn't work.
And when you have the EOP, the uncalled interest rate parity assumption, which obviously is very important.
Yeah, that's very important here, of course. Because we rely on it heavily, because otherwise, if we cannot influence the exchange rate with interest rate, then everything falls apart.
It's true, but if you're a politician or a governor.
Yeah. So what would happen if it is weaker than what we expect? Then you should actually do more. So you should, because that will basically make monetary and fiscal policies more similar. If the interest parity is weak, then it will make those two instruments more similar. Well, then you should actually make them more divergent. That's the optimal reaction to if you don't believe in the UAP or you only believe in a weak UAP, that should actually strengthen the fact that the policy should be divergent.
Does anyone believe in the uncovered interest rate target?
No, yeah, I think so. I mean, at least the one that something that is similar to what we have here, I think many people will believe in. This thing here, with this.
I believe that, there's a...
Because there is a risk premium there, and you know that this risk premium, there's a lot of volatility.
You have a hefty risk premium.
I mean, this one we don't believe in.
No.
That we already, that we don't. But I do think that if you ask most central bankers, they will say that they do believe that the increased interest rate will affect the exchange rate. But they will also say that there's a lot of other things that will reduce and increase the exchange rate all the time.
I'm wondering if you're making the task of the model too easy by having equal number of targets and instruments. In reality, you would have, and if you look at the Icelandic discussion, you would have as one target to keep the real interest rate low. And in your pictures, you show that it jumps like 100% or something like that. So that would be very uneasy for those taking student loans exactly at the time when you are doing this.
Yeah, so this is what we do here.
Okay.
So right, so I mean, so the typically, so this is what we have done so far. Two instruments, two targets, very easy. A more realistic setting is when we add on. So first of all, we don't like too much variation in public spending, and we don't like variation in what we said. We don't like too much variation in the real interest rate. What happens then if we take those two into this analysis? Okay. Of course, then we have more targets. So we're going to have a muted response, right? So if it's just here we just look at the fiscal policy. It's only cost of fiscal policy first. Well, then we're going to use fiscal policy less. Well, that will mean that I have less power to clean up this mess of monetary policy. So I should do less of the monetary policy thing as well. Because now also I have three things that I need to balance. I would like to have inflation close to target. I would like to have real economic stability, but I would also like to not having fiscal spending moving too much over time. Well then, healthy stabilization is no longer possible. Then you kind of rule out that as an option. So you need to balance the three goals, but the policies are still divergent. Yes, you do less, but they're still divergent. You think about it, the cost of fiscal policy is very, very, very large. Well, then you almost do nothing but with fiscal policy. But you do move it in that direction. You're still going to be more expansionary. It's still going to be divergent, but of course much less, because the cost of moving fiscal policy is so large. So the only way to make this divergence go away is if the cost of moving the interest rate is so high, it becomes very large. So there's a tipping point where these policies, even the following this cost per shock, should move into being congruent rather than divergent. And that's where the cost of varying the interest rate becomes very large. And think about, again, if you think about that cost is super large. Of course, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to use fiscal spending in order to drive inflation down. Because fiscal monetary policy cannot be used. It's too costly. But but that's the only that's the only reason for having congruent policies. Unless the cost of moving the interest rate is very large, you should have divergent policies following this kind of this cost per shock or the supply shock. Yes.
I'm just wondering, in reality, what is the real policy over the years? For example, in Norway, is it really following this?
No, apart from one thing, and that's one thing that is, I think that's kind of funny, and that's what automatic stabilizing. It's exactly like this. Think about what the automatic stabilizing is doing. Think about the cost per shock. Well, cost per shock drives up inflation. The central bank drives the economy into recession. What does automatic stabilizers do? Well, they reduce this recession. They make them, it's got an automatic spending in a recession. That's what. So automatic stabilizers, they look similar to optimal policy. It's the discretionary policy that's kind of the opposite.